I really wanted to talk about sort of the story that won't go away, which is Rush Limbaugh. But not just Rush Limbaugh, all the discussions and all the social chatter that's going around this story that, again, won't go away. And who better to help me talk about a story that won't go away is Eric Lundquist from UBM and from Brainyard. How are you, Eric?
Well, I'm doing great, and you're right. This is a story on a lot of levels that's sort of strange and evolving. But I know, so much of the Brainyard, we talk about social networks, how companies are supposed to react to what's going on in the social sphere. And this was really an interesting one to me, because I remember when boycotts used to take like months to develop.
Forever, you had to print signs, you had to organize marches.
You didn't eat the grapes or whatever. It would be years. Something would happen, and then slowly it would organize into a boycott, and it would sort of blow up, and then something would happen. But it strikes me as right now, boycotting and reacting has really become a sort of real time.
Real time.
It
Unbelievable.
Really
and it's, part of this is social, right? The fact that stories can now spread instantly. In some cases, the social channels scoop the traditional media. Things are happening on social channels before they're happening on the other media, right? I mean, this is
absolutely.
The time frame now is almost instantaneous, and communities are all on those channels. I got to get together a mob to go and storm the castle. All I need is a Twitter, right?
Well, and we were talking about TED Talks earlier and these swarming robotic insect things, but this is a sort of the self-organizing part of boycott. How do people find out about it? Okay, so you find out about it. How do you organize? How do you make a decision to move forward?
How do you affect change, right?
Yeah,
the old model was, you got to write a letter, write a letter to the brand. I don't want to, buy your product anymore. And you put it in the mail, and a week later, 2 weeks later, and maybe you get a reply. But the time frame now is compressed almost to instantaneous.
Well, it seems to be. And, I think companies, sometimes they get all wrapped up into, we need to do social media analytics and to know what's going on. But I think there's more to it. How do you, it's nice if you had all those analytics to apply to it, but before you apply analytics, you got to have some sort of process to understand it. And I'm not sure that piece is quite there yet.
Well, it's an interesting case study on multiple levels, and I think this is why the story's not going away. So you have a polarizing central character. So you've got a great character, love him or not.
Right.
And he's feeding the fire too, right? I mean, this is sort of, if I was thinking this from a crisis communications perspective, he's not really following the playbook. He didn't really react instantly. He's continuing to sort of stoke the fire. People are all sort of jumping on the story in multiple ways. The story's not going away because he doesn't want it to go away potentially. And then you've got the whole sort of sub-story about who's dropped advertising next. You've got this sort of rolling list of the advertisers.
And each time one is dropped, that becomes news. So the story never sort of fades.
The next episode.
Here's next? Someone else dropped, but boy, they're still on. Let's go after them. And you really start to wonder, who's in charge? And has the social network community really become the drivers in terms of what's going on for a company these days? And, maybe Rush is an extreme example, but I think there's lessons there for companies to start to learn in terms of how they manage or try to understand. You can't manage your social network. Try to understand their social network.
Well, no doubt, and he's a business, right? So he's a personality, but he's a business, and so business to business has some unique rules too, right? Because it's not just the way that things operate in the consumer world. Business to business has much longer sales cycle, different sorts of relationships, different sort of actors in business to business. It's very interesting to be thinking about how that translates or not to sort of the social sphere.
Right, and you spent some time in crisis communications, and there's always has to be something more than, boy, I'm glad it happened to him. I hope this doesn't happen to me. You have to have some sort of a plan in place, and a little bit of sort of, what are the 5 steps that someone should be thinking about in this area?
Let's talk about some steps, because there's lessons here beyond the media world, and there's lessons here for brands, for companies, as they sort of try to get their arms around. This is an extreme case because it really is crisis communications. But also, if you get ahead of it, then I think you can plan for, a product didn't ship on time, or I have, a recall of a product, or I have an angry customer, the United breaks guitars sort of story. These are all sort of related, right? So how do we get ahead of this? I think we can go through it programmatically. So let's do it, right? I think there are totally 5 rules here that I've been thinking about. I'd love to run it by you and the audience as well. So Number one is thinking about B2B. The difference between B2B and B2C is there's this role of the influencer, the analyst, right? In the traditional, enterprise software, enterprise technology, the mythical analyst that puts you in the magic quadrant, and you need to court them as a vendor, and as a customer, you want to look at what they have to say. So certainly in the playbook, you've got to think about who are those influencers or those advocates, and how do they connect into your network, right? That's got to be the beginning of the playbook.
And that is a big piece of it. And you're seeing a lot of companies come into being to try to identify those influencers, clout and all those people. And people make fun of it that clout's not there yet, but they're working at it. They're working at it. I think some of it is the science of a clout. Some of it is really looking within your own company and saying, who do you follow out there?
No doubt.
Who do you think are the real influencers?
And what's interesting is there's the influence sort of on social channels, like a cloud would be a good example. And then there's the influence sort of that doesn't fit neatly into those social channels. So just because somebody isn't a 80 on cloud doesn't mean that they're not influential in your space. And arguably there's spaces, medical, government areas that maybe there isn't as much adoption on social, that the most influential people, maybe they aren't even represented on the social channels. So influential doesn't necessarily mean just social influential.
Right, and they could have a face in one area, Facebook. They could be doing something else on LinkedIn and another personality on Twitter. You've got to be able to analyze all those pieces and then start to think of, okay, how do I approach this influence?
Yeah, so that brings me to sort of, if you will, our top 5, aligning with the cycle and the rhythm of how business gets done. So this is applicable in the case of the news cycle in terms of the Rush Limbaugh example. It's in the case of how people buy products, how they the life cycle of a product. I think this is super important. And in B2B, unlike sort of commodity purchases, right? And I remember back in the day in e-commerce, I think it's Forrester talked about considered versus non-considered purchases. So I'm going to buy a book, it's not really that considered. I'm going to buy a car, that's considered. There's a lot of other steps in a considered purchase. B2B to me is the extreme, in many cases, considered purchase. I want to invest in infrastructure. I want to invest in a product for my entire business. Right. There's a whole bunch of things that happen during that cycle, and you have to align with that from a social perspective.
Well, right. No one decides that they get up Monday and say, I'm going to build a new data center, and I'm going to decide by 5 o'clock we're going to be done with this. But all that discussion around lead nurturing and where people are in the whole cycle of the buying process, and I hate to make work even more difficult for the marketers out there, but I do think you're going to approach those groups differently. Those people who are in that particular part of the cycle, are they just in sort of the awareness, the interest, desire, purchase? I mean, there's lots of ways to divide it up.
They're typically in that middle sort of area where it's funny because Trip Kassara from Aberdeen, who presented at IMS in New York, has this idea of the hidden sales cycle, and there's a lot of that happening in that sort of middle part where influencers are coming in and out, where research is happening, where people are going through offline evaluations. Maybe they're doing a test, or they're test driving, or they're going on tours of seeing the product in action. All that stuff is part of the sales cycle, even though you might not think it. Not neatly fitting in the CRM system, right? I mean, where does it fit in there?
There's no tag. There's no tag you can put on some of these things, but understanding that is enormous.
So I think that's key because there's a rhythm, and it's related to the language of the social channel as well. I mean, we talk about you have a conversation on Facebook, you use different terminology than a conversation on LinkedIn versus Twitter versus your blog versus other channels. It's not just sort of when you're doing it, but how you're saying it too.
That's right, and it's not just, as I said, it's sort of a different voice in each of those. The Google Plus, your Google circle could be a whole different conversation than what's going on in your Twitter followers.
Yeah, I think Google Plus is a good example of sort of people still finding what that rhythm is and finding what that language is. What is the language of Google Plus? It seems to be kind of a hybrid. It's sort of like Twitter, it's kind of like LinkedIn, it's kind of like blogging, it's sort of a mashup.
I always compared it to discovering a new world. And the natives are speaking a different language, and you've got to either spend enough time to learn it or sail on to another place.
Well, and if you can, right, as a marketer, the worst thing you can do is pop up in one of these channels and act like you don't know what's going on. And you're not speaking the language, or you're inappropriate. It's, the selling insurance at a cocktail party, right? It's like, what? What is this person doing? I just want to talk about, sports. And then I want to talk about insurance.
Life insurance at the funeral. What's our third point?
So third point would be, and this is feeding right into what we've been thinking about a lot here at the Pulse, is content marketing, inbound marketing. Be a resource, right? I'm a business, I'm a marketer. I want to be a resource to these communities. The best way to get invited into a community is to have something to offer up. And then the best way to me to create an inbound marketing program is to tap your network and have the people who are influencing sort of part of your network so you could kind of tap their network as well. I think that's all about, aligning with and bringing useful information.
Well, that is. I think a lot of people miss that point, by the way, that you have to offer something. It has to be something that you're going to give this person, this group, in exchange for the amount of time they're going to spend with you. And it's going to be something more than a white paper that extols your product. There's something, they're giving you time, that's value. You have to give them some value back.
And respect their time, right? And I think we've talked before about sort of the format of that content. You want that content to be tailored to how people are consuming it. Don't try to jam a white paper into a discussion in a channel that says, well, I don't want a white paper. I want a video. I want a how-to. I want a list of bullets. I think tailoring that to the audience in the channel is essential.
Right. I always said, that the idea of hey, it's nice to meet you. Now sit there and I'm going to give you 2 hours of PowerPoint presentation.
There you go. And then I'll give you the PowerPoint too to take with you. Number 4. We've talked a lot about it. Invest in monitoring and listening. So how do you know that they want or they don't want that 2-hour PowerPoint? Because maybe some of them do, but we need to invest in listening. And it's funny because we kind of got away from it. It seems like in early days of social, it was all about listening. How do we align with the discussions and sentiment and find out what people want? And now that we're so advanced in a lot of ways, it seems like we kind of forget to stop talking and start listening.
Well, that's it. And invest in listening to people after you're done with your presentation, after you've made your offer. People just move on too fast sometimes. They do the quick little survey, 5 questions, what do you think, like, don't like? But you really need to go back and say, get deeper. What did you like? What really worked? How did you think, this was our messages? It's a little bit like a focus group, but again, like Rush, it's real time. And be able to make those corrections in real time. Say, okay, well, the way we're messaging, we thought it was going to be this, it's this, let's alter our message. It's listening and acting, I guess.
I'm glad you mentioned focus groups because it seems like those kind of old school means for listening to what people want. We got to forget about how valuable they are. Just like, a good conference, a good workshop is really good because people are not all wired up. Maybe they are, but they can actually sit down and have a discussion about what did you like about this? What did you not like about this?
Right.
And do that in a meaningful way where you understand that people are people. But also doing that, this brings to the last point, is do this ideally before you have to do it. And that's back to tying it back to Rush. Now again, maybe his model is to persist this outrage because it's sort of good for business. His core is not going away.
Right.
But for almost all other businesses, you need to be proactive that if something does happen, deliver that bad news early and get ahead of the curve in terms of, hey, I'm listening. There's something happening with this product, or people are confused about what we said, or people are frustrated. Let's get ahead of this. It's not just offering people a gift, to shut up, but rather telling people that you're listening, that you care.
Well, I think that's a good example of, I think Rush was measuring his success by the number of listeners, and the social networks came in and did it by the amount of influence they have over advertisers, and could they exert that influence. So that's an example of one group's listening to one thing, but another group's doing something else.
Well, it turns out certain advertisers, they like customers, but they also really like customers who want them to be positioned in a certain way. And they really like customers who tell lots of other customers good things. They really don't like customers that are going to tell their friends, whatever you do, don't buy from this company because they've done this and that.
Well, it's brand consideration. How do you reinforce your brand? What are the things that can take away from your brand characteristics? And that's those are 5 good points for a lot of people.
Not bad. So from Rush Limbaugh to flying insect
robotics,
robots,
we got there. We covered a lot of
inbound
territory.
marketing. He's Eric Lundquist. I'm Alan Bonde. Thanks for listening.